Good morning, everyone. I am deeply honored to be here at the Oncology Colloquium 2026. First, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share my experience in the treatment of genitourinary tumors and to discuss the realities of clinical trials in Latin America. Thank you all for being here. Over the last decade, genitourinary oncology has undergone an unprecedented scientific transformation, and across prostate, renal cell, and urothelial cancers, more than a dozen phase 3 randomized trials have reshaped standard of care and demonstrated clear survival benefits. These advances have rapidly translated into international guidelines, with early treatment intensification now recommended in multiple disease settings. From scientific perspective, the evidence is robust, consistent, and mature. However, this progress has not translated uniformly across regions. In Latin America and other low and middle-income countries, access to this innovation remains heterogeneous and frequently delayed. As a result, there is an increasing gap between what we know works and what patients actually receive in routine practice. Importantly, this gap is not driven by the lack of evidence, but by structural challenges related to regulation, reimbursement, and health system capacity. This slide illustrates the central concept of this talk. Clinical benefit does not occur at the moment a trial is published, nor when a guideline is updated. It occurs only when an effective therapy reaches the patient. Between evidence generation and patient-level access, several critical steps intervene: regulatory approval, reimbursement decisions, and clinical implementation. In high-income countries, these steps tend to follow a relatively linear and predictable pathways. In Latin America and other low-middle-income countries, this pathway is frequently fragmented. Delays or failures at any of these points can prevent scientific advances from translating into real-world benefit. Importantly, limited access also feeds back into the system. When access is restricted, participation in clinical research decreases, further reducing opportunities for innovations and equity. This framework helps explain why, despite robust global evidence, outcomes remain unequal across regions. Between 2018 and 2026, genitourinary oncology experienced one of the fastest evidence expansions in solid tumors. Across prostate, renal cell, and urothelial cancers, multiple phase 3 trials fundamentally changed standard of care. This period marks a clear transition from sequential monotherapy approaches to early combination strategies with consistent survival benefits. Importantly, international guidelines were updated at an unprecedented pace, often within months of trial publications. While this rapid evolution represented a major scientific success, it also increased the complexity of implementation, particularly in health systems with limited regulatory agility and constrained resources. Now, prostate cancer is probably the clearest example of how rapidly evidence has evolved in genitourinary oncology. Since 2018, multiple phase 3 trials have consistently shown that early treatment intensification in metastatic hormone-sensitive disease significantly improves in overall survival. Abiraterone, enzalutamide, apalutamide, and more recently, triplet strategies combining ADT, docetaxel, and AR targeted agents have reshaped the standard of care. As a result, international guidelines now strongly recommend doublet or triplet strategies for the majority of patients. regardless of disease volume or risk category. Now, however, the prostate cancer story also illustrates the profound gap between evidence generation and real-world implementation. While guidelines recommend treatment intensification as the standard of care in many low and middle-income countries, patients still receive ADT alone or, at best, ADT plus docetaxel. Access to sequential therapy, genomics testing, and clinical trials remains limited and highly heterogeneous across the region. Importantly, this gap is not driven by lack of evidence, but by structural barriers such as drug availability, reimbursement policies, regulatory delays, and low trial density, for example. Now, renal cell carcinoma represents one of the most successful stories of immune-oncology in solid tumors. Since 2018, several randomized phase 3 trials have consistently demonstrated overall survival benefits with immune-based combination strategies in the first-line treatment of advanced clear renal cell carcinoma. And both IO-IO and IO-TKI combination have shown robust efficacy across IMDC risk categories, fundamentally displacing TKI monotherapy as the standard of care. As a result, international guidelines now recommend combination therapy as first-line treatment for the vast majority of patients with advanced disease. But despite this remarkable scientific progress, the real-world reality in many low and middle-income countries is very different. In several settings, access to immune-based combinations remains limited or delayed, and first-line treatment still relies on TKI monotherapy. Risk stratification is not consistently applied, sequencing options are restricted, and participation in clinical trials remains low. In this context, the key challenge is no longer choosing between combination regimens, but whether combination therapy is available at all, with clear implications, of course, for survival outcomes and equity. Urothelial cancer is a clear example of how quickly standard of care can evolve when robust evidence emerges. For example, the introduction of maintenance immunotherapy after platinum-based chemotherapy represented a major paradigm shift, establishing avelumab as a new standard with clear survival benefit. More recently, phase 3 trials have demonstrated that perioperative immunotherapy can meaningfully improve outcomes in muscle-invasive bladder cancer, further expanding the role of immunotherapy earlier in the disease course. At the same time, antibody-drug conjugates and biomarker-driven approaches are rapidly expanding the therapeutic landscape with increasing interest in earlier disease settings. As a result, international guidelines have had to adapt at an unprecedented pace. Despite these major therapeutic advances, implementation remains highly uneven across low and middle-income countries. Maintaining immunotherapy is not universally available. Perioperative immunotherapy is inconsistently adapted, and access to antibody-drug conjugates remains highly variable. And, for example, biomarker testing is often limited or unavailable, further restricting the use of targeted agents and biomarker-driven strategies. As in other genitourinary malignancies, this gap is driven not by lack of evidence, but by structural barriers related to access, reimbursement, regulatory timelines, and limited participation in clinical trials. Latin America plays a relevant role in global oncology research, particularly in large phase 3 trials. However, this participation is heavily skewed toward late-phase confirmatory studies, with more than 60% of trial in the region being phase 3. Trial activity is also highly concentrated, with more than 90% of studies originating from only 6 countries. In addition, the vast majority of trials are industry-sponsored, which facilitates recruitment but limits academic leadership and agenda settings. Perhaps most importantly, Latin America remains underrepresented when trial activity is viewed in relation to population size and cancer burden. This imbalance highlights the structural paradox: high contribution to evidence generation, but limited influence and downstream benefit. Now, participation in clinical trial does not automatically translate into leadership, innovation, or access. Early phase research remains rare in the region, limiting exposure to novel mechanisms, biomarker development, and translational science. Despite meaningful patient recruitment, regional investigators are infrequently involved as principal investigators or senior authors. Finally, even when trials are successfully completed, more post-approval access is often delayed or incomplete due to regulatory, financial, and health system barriers. This helps explain why participation alone is insufficient to close the evidence access gap. This figure clearly illustrates one of the central paradoxes of clinical research in Latin America. Despite representing a large genetically diverse population with a significant cancer burden, clinical trial activity is highly concentrated in a small number of countries and academic hubs. More than 90% of trials originate from only 6 countries, and the vast majority are industry-sponsored. While this model facilitates participation in global research, it does not consistently translate into regional leadership, early phase innovation, or sustained access to approved therapies. Understanding this geographic imbalance is essential to move from participation to strategic integration in global oncology research. Across prostate, renal, and urothelial cancer, what we observe is not a lack of evidence, but a lack of system capable of translating evidence into equitable care. The evidence implementation gap begins early. Less than 2.5% of global phase 2 oncology trials include Latin America sites, which limits early exposure to innovation, biomarker development, and trial leadership. Even when late phase trials are conducted, more than 90% are led by high-income countries, reinforcing a model where participation does not translate into influence or ownership. Downstream regulatory delays, fragmented reimbursement pathways, and health system constraints further slow the adoption of guideline recommended standards. These barriers operate upstream of clinical decision-making and explain why survival gains observed in clinical trials are not evenly reproduced in real-world middle-income country settings. Now, if we accept that the evidence implementation gap in genitourinary oncology is fundamentally structural, then the solution must also operate at the system level. No single tumor type, drug, or guideline update will be sufficient to close this gap. What is required are coordinated strategies that reshape how evidence is generated, evaluated, and translated into care in low and middle income settings. One of the most immediate opportunities lies in trial designs. Global studies that incorporate low-middle-income countries from the outset produce evidence that is more general and more implementable. Regulatory harmonization and early access models can further shorten the time between evidence generation and real work availability without compromising scientific rigor. Ultimately, sustainable progress depends on collaboration between academia, policymakers, regulators, and industry. This is not only a challenge, it is also an opportunity, and Latin America is unequally positioned to be part of the solution. Up to this point, we have discussed access, implementation gaps, and structural barriers. This slide shifts the focus from limitation to strategic position. Latin America should no longer be viewed solely as a region for patient recruitment. The region carries a substantial burden of genitourinary cancers and has experienced clinician and increasingly robust academic centers. Latin America already contributes meaningfully to global phase 3 recruitment in prostate, renal, and urothelial cancers. However, this participation remains largely confirmatory rather than innovative. What is still limited is leadership, defining research questions, shaping trial design, leading early phase studies, and contributing proportionally to authorship and governance. This matters because inclusive participation is not only an equity issue, it directly affects the external validity and real-world relevance in clinical trials. Moving from recruitment to leadership is therefore not aspirational, but necessary in global oncology research, is to remain essentially robust and clinically meaningful. And Latin America is unequally positioned to play that role. What has changed in clinical practice is not only what we treat with, but how fast standards evolve and how complex optimal care has become. This evolution placed clinical research at the center of modern oncology because without timely representative trials, these standards cannot be translated equitably. In Latin America, the gap we observe today is no longer a knowledge gap. It is a structural and research access gap, where rapidly evolving evidence outpaces the capacity of health systems and clinical trial infrastructure to keep up. The question today is no longer whether innovation works. We already know it does. The real question is whether our research systems are designed to deliver that innovation equitably. What we have seen across prostate, renal, and urothelial cancer is a consistent pattern. The evidence is global, but access is not. Latin America should not be viewed as peripheral to this challenge. It is central to the future global clinical research, not only as a contributor of patients, but as a contributor of ideas, leaderships, and solutions. Thank you very much for showing me today and for being part of this discussion. I truly appreciate your time, your attention, and your ongoing commitment to advancing oncology. Thank you so much.